You're listening to Nora and Noah Decode the Day, where markets meet meaning every morning.
Isn't it interesting how sometimes the quiet moments, they can actually speak the loudest? This recent trade truce between China and the U.S., it seems like just a pause, right? But it's actually causing quite a stir globally.
It really is.
Yeah.
Other nations are definitely watching, and it's making them rethink their own negotiating strategies with the U.S.
Exactly. This isn't just about the specific details of that one agreement.
No, not at all. What we're really digging into today is how this truce, or maybe even just the perception of how it went down, is kind of changing the playbook for other countries.
Right. How they approach trade talks with Washington now.
Precisely.
So we've been looking through quite a bit of analysis on the global trade landscape, seeing how things are shifting after these developments.
Yeah.
Consider this our deep dive to get you up to speed quickly and hopefully thoroughly on what's a pretty complex issue and maybe reveal some surprising shifts.
Sounds good.
So to kick us off, what's the basic idea behind this China-U.S. trade truce? What are we actually talking about here?
Okay, so at its core, it's basically a ceasefire. A halt to any new tariff increases between the U.S. and China.
After things had been really escalating.
Exactly. Now, they talked about a baseline rate in Geneva, maybe around 30% on some goods.
Okay.
But, and this is important, when you add in all the tariffs that were already imposed before the truce, well, the average U.S. import tax on Chinese stuff is actually closer to 50% right now.
Wow, okay. 50% average. That makes the next bit quite striking then, doesn't it?
Uh-huh.
The U.S. apparently backed away from an earlier threat, a really massive one, of 145% duty on China.
That's right. A huge potential number. And stepping back from that, well, that's a pretty significant shift in posture.
It feels like it.
Yeah.
And you can bet other countries notice.
Oh, absolutely. Which brings us right to the key question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Has China's approach, often seen as quite firm, quite resolute, has that influenced how other nations are thinking about their talks with the U.S.?
This is where it gets really fascinating, I think. The feeling we're getting from the analysis is yes. China's perceived success, even if it's just a temporary pause, achieved through what looks like a pretty firm stance, it seems to be making other countries question their own methods.
Especially those who might have been more, let's say, diplomatic or accommodating initially.
Exactly. They're wondering if maybe they gave ground too easily, perhaps. It suggests a potential shift in the power dynamic of these negotiations.
There's definitely a reassessment happening. Stephen Olson made this observation. He said something like, many countries will look at the outcome of the Geneva negotiations and conclude that Trump has begun to realize that he has overplayed his hand.
That's quite a statement. Overplayed his hand.
It points to this growing perception, right or wrong, that maybe the U.S. is willing to bend more than people thought if pushed.
It really does. So nations that might have been quick to engage, maybe offer concessions early on,
Yeah.
they might now be thinking, hang on, should we be taking a tougher line from the start?
It raises the question.
Let's look at some specific examples. How are different countries actually reacting? What are they considering? Maybe start with South Korea.
Okay, South Korea. We're seeing some interesting chatter there, particularly in their domestic politics.
Oh.
Lee Jae-myung, who's a leading presidential candidate, he's actually criticized the current interim government's approach to the U.S. talks.
How so?
He called it hasty. He said there's no need to rush into an agreement.
Hasty. So that suggests a possible shift if he comes to power. A more measured, maybe firmer stance?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Depending on how their election turns out, of course.
Interesting. Okay, what about India? We heard President Trump say India was ready to lower all its tariffs on U.S. goods.
Yeah, that statement. It seems it might have been jumping the gun a little.
Really?
India's External Affairs Minister, Jaishankar, he clarified pretty quickly that, look, talks are ongoing.
Right.
And drawing any conclusions right now would be premature, was his word.
Premature.
And you also had their Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, scheduled for a trip to the U.S. specifically for more talks. So negotiations are definitely happening.
Just maybe not on the terms Trump initially suggested.
Seems that way, yes.
Yeah.
Still very much in progress.
Got it. Okay, let's shift over to Japan. Their approach feels a bit different, maybe more subtle. Strategic timing, perhaps?
There are definitely nuances there. You had their trade minister, Yojimuto, skipping a regional meeting where the U.S. trade rep was present.
Which could mean anything, I suppose.
It could. But then you look at the timeline. Their top negotiator, Akazawa, initially hoped for a deal around June.
Right.
But the latest reports suggest, well, maybe July is more likely now.
And why July?
It potentially lines up with their upcoming upper house election.
Okay. So domestic politics playing a role.
It suggests they might be deliberately pacing things. Policymakers in Tokyo might prefer taking their time, avoiding big concessions just to get a quick deal done, especially before an election.
So the timing itself becomes part of the negotiation, signaling they're not desperate for a rapid conclusion.
It certainly could be interpreted that way. A preference for a well-thought-out agreement over speed.
Makes sense. Now, what about the European Union? They seem to see this whole U.S.-China situation a bit differently again.
They do. Officials in Brussels seem, let's say, skeptical about the U.S.-China truce.
Skeptical how?
Well, they point out that it leaves pretty high tariffs still in place, and the scope seems limited.
Not a comprehensive solution.
Not in their view. Their assessment is that the U.S. didn't really gain much, the negotiating gains were meager, and there's no clear end game.
Meager gains.
Valdis Dombrovskis, he's a top economic official at the European Commission, he talked about a fragmented trade landscape.
Fragmented, meaning everyone's doing their own thing.
Kind of. Suggesting these one-off bilateral deals aren't really fixing the bigger systemic trade issues.
So the EU is watching, but they don't necessarily see the U.S.-China truce as a model to follow.
It doesn't seem like it. They appear more focused on their own path, perhaps less impressed by the outcome of that specific negotiation.
Interesting. Okay, what about countries in Latin America? They seem caught in the middle somehow.
Yeah, they're in a really delicate spot, a real balancing act.
Why is that?
They want to keep that significant investment flowing in from China.
Right, which is huge for many of them.
Absolutely. But they also desperately need to maintain their access to the U.S. market.
Can't afford to alienate either side.
Exactly. So they have to tread very carefully in how they navigate the relationship between those two giants.
Tricky position. And then there's Vietnam. Huge dependence on U.S. trade, you mentioned.
Massive. Something like a third of their entire economy is tied to trade with the U.S.
Wow. So what kind of leverage do they have? Can they afford to push back hard?
It's tough for them. Beyond, diplomatic channels and expressing concern, their leverage is somewhat limited.
They did voice concerns, didn't they? Called Trump's tariffs unreasonable.
They did. And they even offered earlier on to buy more U.S. goods to try and smooth things over.
But ultimately, their options for really strong pushback are probably constrained by just how much they rely on that U.S. economic link.
That seems to be the reality, yes.
So we're seeing this whole spectrum of reactions, aren't we? Really depends on each country's economic weight, their specific ties to the U.S.
Absolutely. Which leads us nicely into this idea of shifting leverage and tactics. It's not just about goods tariffs anymore, is it?
What else is in play?
Well, Katrina L. from Moody's Analytics makes a really important point about services trade.
Ah, services. Okay.
Especially for more developed economies. She points out that places like the EU, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, they all run significant services trade deficits with the U.S.
Meaning the U.S. sells more services to them than they sell to the U.S.
Exactly. Which suggests these countries might find some negotiating power there in sectors beyond just physical goods.
So they could use access to their own services markets as a kind of bargaining chip.
That's the idea. As Katrina L. put it, China has too much leverage over the U.S. for the U.S. to continue with its hardline stance, whereas that's not the case for many other economies.
Okay.
She says leverage, and who has that leverage is what we need to keep in mind.
Leverage is key.
And Marco Papek from BCA Research sort of echoes this, suggesting there are many countries that may learn from China that the correct way to negotiate with President Trump is to stand firm, remain calm, and force him to capitulate.
Wow. Force him to capitulate. Strong words.
It is. But you see hints of this maybe in the EU's measured response or Japan's strategic timing we discussed, perhaps early signs of this kind of reevaluation.
It's a really fascinating idea that China's tough stance could maybe unintentionally empower other nations to try a similar, more assertive strategy.
It could change the dynamic.
But what's the view from the U.S. side? Are they noticing these shifts? How are they seeing these negotiations play out with various countries?
Well, the sources suggest the U.S. is definitely aware things are complex. President Trump himself noted there just isn't time to strike individual deals with, like, 150 countries.
Yeah, that's a lot of deals.
And he even hinted, that they might just unilaterally assign higher tariffs soon if deals aren't reached.
There's a bit of pressure there.
And Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick also acknowledged that talks with key partners like Japan and South Korea, they're expected to take time. That aren't quick fixes.
Okay. And what about the EU? You mentioned their skepticism. Did the U.S. side comment on negotiating with them?
Yeah, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent initially pointed to the EU's perceived lack of unity as something hindering talks, making it harder to negotiate with them as a single bloc.
Right. We touched on that fragmentation idea earlier.
We did. But interestingly, Bessent later sounded more optimistic, more broadly about trade talks in general.
Oh, how so?
He noted that countries are coming with very good proposals. Proposals aimed at lowering not just tariffs, but also those non-tariff barriers.
Things like quotas, regulations, stuff that restricts trade without being a tax.
Exactly. And also addressing issues like currency manipulation and subsidies. So signs of engagement on multiple fronts.
So movement is happening.
And he also made the point, Bessent did, that we didn't get here overnight, suggesting, that this is a long game. These trade issues took time to build up and they'll take time to resolve, a long-term perspective.
Okay. So acknowledging the different approaches, the different timelines, maybe some impatience, but also a sense from the U.S. side that overall progress is being made even if it's uneven.
Precisely. Different speeds, different challenges with different countries.
Which really brings us back to the core takeaway here, doesn't it?
I think so.
This China-U.S. trade truce, it seemed like just a two-country thing initially.
Yeah.
But it's actually set off this global chain reaction, this reassessment of trade negotiation strategies everywhere.
Absolutely. Some countries are clearly thinking about getting tougher, maybe taking a page from China's book.
While others just don't have the same economic muscle or face different constraints in their relationship with the U.S.
Exactly. The whole situation is still very much in flux. The outcomes could look very different depending on the country.
So the core insight, just to synthesize it for everyone listening, that initial pause in the U.S.-China friction, it's unexpectedly become this catalyst for a worldwide rethink on trade talks.
Yeah.
It just highlights how one major power's actions or perceived actions can ripple outwards and really influence how so many others play the game.
It really does. And it leaves us with a question for you, the listener, doesn't it?
Go on.
As you hear about all these different reactions, these varying strategies, what do you think is the most effective long-term approach for countries trying to navigate this current global trade environment?
Good question.
And maybe, what are the unforeseen consequences that might pop up from all these shifting tactics? It's this complex balance, isn't it? Diplomacy versus firmness, all against the backdrop of hard economic realities in a world that just keeps changing.
That's it for today's Decode. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe, and we'll catch you tomorrow, right here on Nora and Noah Decode the Day.